The wind was a physical blow, a monstrous, invisible fist that sought to pummel the life from her. Snow, whipped into a frenzy, did not fall but flew horizontally, stinging her exposed skin like a million tiny needles. Elara huddled deeper into the inadequate layers of her coat, the thin wool offering scant defense against the blizzard's fury. Each breath was a shard of ice in her lungs, shallow and painful. She had lost the trail hours ago. Maybe days. Time was a meaningless concept in this white hell. Her horse, desperate and terrified, had pulled free from its tether during the worst of the initial squall, vanishing into the maelstrom, taking with it her meager supplies and the last tattered remnants of her hope. Now, there was only the endless, blinding white, the roar of the wind, and the terrifying, gnawing cold that seeped into her bones, promising oblivion. Fear, raw and primal, had long since given way to a weary resignation. Her fingers and toes were numb, unresponsive lumps at the ends of her limbs. She stumbled forward, then sideways, then simply sank to her knees in a drift, too exhausted to stand. Her eyes, crusted with ice, scanned the swirling chaos, searching for anything, a rock, a tree, a shadow that might offer shelter, but there was nothing. Only the relentless, indifferent onslaught of the storm. Despair settled over her, heavy and absolute. She was lost, alone, and utterly, irrevocably at the mercy of the mountain. Memories flickered like dying embers. A warm kitchen, laughter, a face now gone. They were cruel, beautiful ghosts in this desolate place. She closed her eyes, the snow pressing against her eyelids. It would be so easy, she thought, just to let go, to sink into the cold embrace and let the mountain claim her. A tear, instantly freezing, traced a path down her cheek. This was it, the end. The wind howled its mournful elegy. A shadow, darker and more solid than the swirling snow, appeared at the periphery of her vision. She blinked, thinking it another trick of the cold or her fading consciousness. But it remained, growing larger, resolving into a figure, tall and broad, moving with a strange, almost unnatural ease through the tempest. He was bundled in thick furs, a hood obscuring his face, snow clinging to his beard and brows like frost. He stopped a few yards away, a still point in the maelstrom, observing her. She couldn't make out his features, but felt the weight of his gaze. Was he real, or a hallucination born of her desperation? Fear, sharp and unexpected, pierced through her apathy. This man, appearing from nowhere in the heart of the blizzard, was as unknown and potentially dangerous as the storm itself. She tried to push herself up, a futile, weak movement. He didn't speak, didn't offer a hand. He simply watched for another long moment, then moved towards her with deliberate, unhurried steps. His presence didn't feel like salvation. It felt like another element of the mountain's terrifying power, enigmatic and formidable. He reached her, his movements economical and decisive. He didn't offer comfort or reassurance. Instead, he knelt beside her, his gloved hand touching her face, assessing the frostbite. His touch was firm, impersonal. She flinched, a tiny, involuntary tremor running through her frozen body. His eyes, visible now beneath the hood, were dark and steady, holding no discernible emotion. They seemed to belong to the landscape itself, ancient and knowing. He rose smoothly, then, without a word, he reached down, scooping her into his arms. The action was startlingly gentle despite his obvious strength. She was light as a bundle of frozen rags. He held her close against his fur-clad chest, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a faint hint of warmth radiating from another human body. He turned, beginning to move through the blizzard again, not back the way she had come, but in a direction she couldn't discern through the thick snow. His steps were sure, his balance unwavering on the treacherous ground. She could hear the crunch of his snowshoes, a steady, rhythmic sound beneath the shriek of the wind. Curled against him, too weak to resist, she surrendered to the movement, the faint warmth, the sheer exhaustion. Her head rested against his shoulder, and the scent of wood smoke and pine, faint but distinct, reached her. It was the smell of life, of shelter, alien and wonderful in this deathly place. She didn't know who he was, or where he was taking her, but for the first time, a fragile, hesitant flicker of something other than despair stirred within her. She wasn't alone anymore, not completely. The thought was a tiny ember against the overwhelming cold. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the steady rhythm of his steps, the relentless wind, and the faint, life-giving warmth of the stranger who carried her. The journey seemed endless, a timeless suspension between the storm's ferocity and the promise of something else. He carried her effortlessly, a silent, tireless figure against the backdrop of the raging blizzard. Elara remained semi-conscious, the cold still biting, but dulled by the proximity of another body and the sheer inertia of her exhaustion. She felt the subtle shifts in his balance, the strength in the arms that held her, the even cadence of his breathing beneath the fur and wool. There was no conversation, no words exchanged. The mountain man was a force of nature himself, as stoic and formidable as the environment he navigated. He simply moved, carrying his fragile, frozen burden through the chaos. At some point, the incline changed. They were climbing, though she felt none of the effort in his body. The wind seemed to lessen slightly, the snow perhaps less dense, suggesting they might be entering a more sheltered area, or maybe she was simply too far gone to register the full force of the storm. Then, abruptly, the sound of the wind changed. It didn't cease, but was muffled, redirected. There was a different quality to the air, less open and exposed. She felt a shift, a moment where he adjusted his hold, and then a change in temperature, subtle at first, then more pronounced. It was still bitterly cold, but not the soul-freezing chill of the open mountain. He had found shelter. He paused, and she heard the scrape of wood, the muffled thud of a door opening. A wave of warm air, heavy with the scent of wood smoke and something cooking, washed over her. It was intoxicating, overwhelming after the sterile, biting cold. He stepped inside, the door closing behind them, sealing them away from the storm's fury. The sudden quiet was profound, broken only by the crackling of a fire and the man's soft, even breaths. He carried her across a floor that felt solid beneath his boots and gently lowered her onto something soft, a pile of furs near the source of the heat. She lay there, disoriented and weak, slowly registering her surroundings. The cabin was small, constructed of rough-hewn logs, simple but sturdy. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a fire burning brightly within it, casting dancing shadows across the room. There was a table, a chair, shelves lined with jars and tools, and a narrow bunk built into the wall. Everything was neat, orderly, speaking of a life lived with deliberate purpose and self-reliance. The man knelt beside her, his face now visible in the firelight. He was older than she had first assumed, his face lined and weathered, a thick, dark beard framing a strong jaw. His eyes, the same dark, steady eyes she had seen in the storm, regarded her with a quiet intensity that was unnerving but lacked malice. He was dressed in simple, practical clothing beneath the furs, worn deerskin trousers and a heavy wool shirt. He moved with the quiet grace of someone entirely comfortable in his space, utterly in tune with his environment. He reached for a mug near the fire, the steam rising from it fragrant with herbs. He didn't speak, simply held it to her lips. "Drink," he said, his voice low and rumbling, like distant thunder. It was the first word she had heard him utter. Her lips were cracked and stiff, but she managed to swallow the warm liquid. It was bitter but comforting, spreading heat through her chest. He held the mug patiently, letting her take small sips until she could manage no more. Then he carefully lowered her head back onto the furs. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, to offer thanks, but her throat was tight, her body numb with cold and exhaustion. All she could manage was a weak sigh. He watched her for another moment, then rose and moved silently about the cabin, tending to the fire, preparing something at the table. She lay there, too weary to move, her mind a jumble of fear, relief, and confusion. She was safe from the storm, yes, But now she was alone in a remote cabin with a man she knew nothing about. The quiet solitude of the cabin, broken only by the crackling fire, felt both like a sanctuary and a cage. Over the next hours, perhaps days, time was still a fluid concept, dictated by the rhythm of the storm outside, and the man's quiet routine within. Alara began the slow, painful process of thawing and recovering. Her body ached with a deep, bone-weary soreness. The initial warmth of the cabin brought with it the burning sensation of returning circulation, particularly in her extremities, a pain so intense it made her bite back cries. The man, whose name she learned was Caleb when she finally managed a weak, raspy thank you, responded with a simple nod and his steady gaze. He didn't hover, didn't make a fuss. He was a presence, quiet and constant. He brought her small amounts of broth, thin but nourishing, held the mug for her until she could manage to grip it herself, though her fingers were still clumsy and painful. He checked her hands and feet for frostbite, his touch still impersonal but careful. He didn't pry, didn't ask how she came to be in the blizzard, or what she was doing on the mountain. He simply provided for her basic needs with an efficiency that spoke of long practice and a deep understanding of survival. She watched him from her place by the fire. He mended a tear in his deerskin trousers with precise, economic stitches. He sharpened a knife, the stone rasping rhythmically. He checked his snares outside, returning with a small rabbit, which he prepared and cooked with practiced skill. He moved with a quiet strength, his body lean and capable. There was a self-possession about him, an air of complete comfort in his isolation and surroundings that both intimidated and fascinated her. He was a part of the mountain, not just living on it, but of it. Her initial fear of him, the fear of the unknown stranger, began to recede, replaced by a tentative sense of security. He was not unkind. He was simply there. Solid, reliable, quiet. His silence wasn't menacing. It was companionable, like the silence of the mountain itself. She started to notice small things. The way he banked the fire carefully each night, ensuring the cabin remained warm. The gentle way he handled his tools, the almost reverent respect with which he treated the wild game he brought in. He spoke only when necessary, his words sparse and direct. More broth. Fire needs tending. Storms still high. Slowly, painstakingly, her strength began to return. The pain in her extremities lessened to a dull ache. She could sit up for longer periods, her mind clearing from the fog of cold and exhaustion. She managed a few hesitant steps, supported by the rough logs of the wall. Caleb watched her progress with his quiet, observing eyes, offering no praise or encouragement, just a steady presence that somehow made the effort feel worthwhile. The cabin, initially a place of anxious uncertainty, was beginning to feel like a refuge. The constant roar of the blizzard outside was no longer a terrifying threat but a distant, powerful force held at bay by the sturdy walls and the quiet strength of the man who had built them. As her physical strength improved, Alara's mind began to stir more fully. The fear had ebbed, but in its place came the questions, the memories she had tried to outrun, the circumstances that had led her to be lost and alone on this unforgiving mountain. One afternoon, the storm had lessened slightly, though the snow still fell steadily. Caleb was checking his trap line, a task he performed regardless of the weather, moving like a shadow in the snow. Alara sat by the fire, her limbs still stiff but no longer painful, watching the flames dance. The silence in the cabin felt different today, less companionable, more empty. It pressed in on her, mirroring the vast, empty space inside herself. She thought of her husband, gone too soon, of the life they had planned, of the crushing weight of debt and expectation that had fallen upon her shoulders after his death. The farm, the one place she had ever truly belonged, was lost. The desperation that had driven her to seek a new beginning, a remote claim on the frontier, felt foolish now, almost suicidal in its naivety. The grief, the loss, the shame of failure, it all rose up, a tide of raw emotion she had kept buried beneath the immediate need for survival. She didn't realize she was weeping until a tear, hot on her cold cheek, startled her. The quiet sobs racked her body. She wasn't just crying for the life she'd lost. but for the fear, the loneliness, the sheer, agonizing vulnerability of the past days. She felt exposed, stripped bare by the storm and the simple, unblinking honesty of Caleb's presence. She had nothing left to hide behind, no social pretense, no familiar comforts, just the raw core of herself, broken and afraid. Caleb returned shortly after, bringing with him the sharp scent of cold air and pine. He entered the cabin, shook the snow from his furs, and stopped when he saw her. She tried to quickly wipe her eyes, to compose herself, but it was useless. He didn't look away or feign ignorance. His gaze, as always, was steady and observing. He didn't rush to her side, didn't offer platitudes. He simply went about his business, tending to the fire, but his movements were perhaps a fraction slower, his presence more overtly watchful. After a time, he sat on the stool near the fire, across from her. He didn't say anything, just sat in companionable silence. The fire crackled. The wind still whispered outside. She felt the weight of his presence. Not judgmental, not pitying, just present. It was different from the way others had reacted to her grief and hardship, with awkward sympathy, unwanted advice, or thinly veiled censure. Caleb offered only quiet space and acceptance. Hesitantly, tentatively, the words began to spill out, halting at first, then gaining a fragile momentum. She spoke of the farm, of Henry, of his death, of the crushing debt, of the neighbors' cold indifference, of her desperate flight. She spoke of the fear that had driven her onto the mountain, the foolish hope she had clung to, the moment she knew she was lost. She didn't explain everything, didn't need to. Caleb listened without interruption, his dark eyes fixed on her face. His expression remained unreadable, yet she felt a profound sense of being heard, truly heard, for the first time in a long time. When she finished, exhausted and emotionally raw, the silence returned. It was no longer empty, but filled with the weight of her confession and the quiet acceptance of the man who had listened. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the storm and the simple needs of survival. Alara continued to regain her strength, helping Caleb with small tasks, stirring the stew, folding furs, gathering kindling from a sheltered woodpile near the cabin. Each small act was a reclaiming of agency, a step away from the helplessness that had defined her in the blizzard. Caleb remained consistent, quiet, capable, observant. Their communication remained sparse, centered on practicalities. Yet, a deeper connection was forming in the silences, in the shared space, in the quiet understanding that had bloomed after she had spoken of her past. She learned a little more about him, not through direct questions and answers, but through observation and his occasional brief remarks. He had lived on the mountain for many years, alone. He knew its moods, its dangers, its hidden generosity. He lived off the land, trapping, fishing when the streams weren't frozen, foraging. His self-sufficiency was absolute. There were hints of a life before the mountain, a brief, veiled reference to the world outside, spoken with a note of weariness that suggested rejection, or perhaps being rejected by it. One evening, the storm had finally begun to abate, the wind lessening to a mournful sigh, the snowfall thinning. The cabin felt less like an isolated haven and more like a place of temporary refuge. Alara knew her time here was finite. The prospect of leaving, of facing the world outside again, was daunting. The mountain had stripped away her illusions, shown her the harsh reality of her situation. But this cabin, and Caleb's quiet presence, had also offered a sanctuary where she could begin to heal, both physically and emotionally. That night, a different kind of tension settled in the cabin. It wasn't born of fear, but of the unspoken knowledge that the temporary world they had built together was coming to an end. Alara sat by the fire, watching Caleb prepare his traps. The silence was heavier than usual. She felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. What would she do when the storm was over? Where would she go? The future stretched before her, uncertain and bleak. She had survived the mountain, but could she survive the world of people, of judgment, of struggle? Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the cabin wall, followed by a scraping sound. Both Alara and Caleb froze, their eyes meeting. Caleb's hand went instantly to the knife on his belt, his body becoming still, alert. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by muffled voices. Someone was outside. The quiet isolation of the cabin was shattered, replaced by the sudden, sharp intrusion of the world they had been hiding from. Fear, cold and sharp, seized Alara. Who could it be? Other trappers? Lawmen? Or something worse? The mountain had shown its power, but the power of desperate, cruel men was something she understood on a different, more visceral level. The fragile peace of the cabin was broken. The voices outside grew louder, rough and demanding. Caleb moved silently towards the door, his expression unreadable, but his stance radiating a quiet readiness. Alara's heart pounded against her ribs. She didn't know who was out there, but the sound of their voices, coarse and impatient, filled her with dread. Caleb signaled her to stay back, melting into the shadows near the door. "Open up. We know you're in there, mountain man." A voice boomed, followed by another heavy thud against the door. Caleb remained still, listening. He didn't respond. "Don't make us break it down," another voice threatened. "We saw your smoke. Got a lost woman in there. Do ya? Found her in the storm." There was a suggestive, cruel edge to the last sentence that made Alara's blood run cold. They knew she was here. Caleb glanced back at Alara, a brief, assessing look. In his eyes, she saw not fear, but a cold, hard calculation. He turned back to the door. "Leave," he said, his voice low but carrying through the thick wood. "There's nothing for you here." Laughter answered him from outside. "Nothing? We heard different. Heard there was something valuable taken from down country. And we heard about a lone woman disappearing. Put two and two together." The accusation was clear, nonsensical in its details, but dangerous in its intent. They weren't looking for a lost woman. They were opportunists, perhaps trackers or bounty hunters with bad information, or simply men looking for trouble and anything they could steal, using her presence as an excuse. The sounds outside became more aggressive, scraping, the splintering of wood. They were trying to force the door. Caleb moved swiftly to a spot near the hearth, retrieving a long, heavy rifle. He checked the load with practiced efficiency. "Get behind the table," he instructed Alara, his voice calm and steady. She obeyed instantly, crawling behind the sturdy wooden table, her body trembling. This was the world she had fled, crashing into her sanctuary. The door groaned under the strain. Caleb took a position to the side, out of the direct line of fire if they managed to breach it. Alara peeked over the edge of the table, watching him, her breath catching in her throat. He was utterly focused, his face grim. The silence in the cabin was tense, broken only by the sounds of the assault on the door and Alara's ragged breathing. The trust that had slowly built between them solidified in this moment of shared danger. He wasn't just a rescuer. He was her protector, facing this threat alongside her. The door suddenly burst inward with a crash of splintered wood. Two figures stumbled into the cabin, bundled against the cold, rifles raised. They were rough-looking men, faces hardened by the elements and something meaner. Before they could fully orient themselves, Caleb moved. He didn't hesitate. The rifle cracked, the sound deafening in the small space. One of the intruders crumpled to the floor with a cry. The second man swore, raising his rifle, but Caleb was already moving, dropping his spent rifle and lunging forward with surprising speed, knife in hand. There was a brief, brutal struggle in the flickering firelight, grunts and curses, the sound of tearing cloth. Alara squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, flinching from the violence, but forced herself to open them, needing to see. Caleb fought with a primal efficiency, using the close quarters to his advantage. It was over quickly. The second man fell, silenced. The cabin was plunged into a sudden, ringing silence, broken only by the crackling fire and Alara's trembling breaths. The smell of gunpowder mixed with wood smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Caleb stood over the fallen men, his chest heaving slightly, the knife still in his hand. His face was set, grim. He looked utterly capable, utterly formidable. He had protected her, protected his home with a swift, ruthless violence that was terrifying and, in this moment, deeply reassuring. He turned then, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, checking for any other threats, his eyes finally resting on Alara, still huddled behind the table. The intensity in his gaze softened slightly. "It's over," he said, his voice quiet again, the shift from protector to calm rescuer abrupt and disorienting. Alara slowly rose from behind the table, her legs shaky. She looked at the two bodies on the floor, then back at Caleb. He met her gaze steadily, his dark eyes holding a depth of experience she could only guess at. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't shown fear. He had simply acted decisively and effectively. The fragile sense of safety in the cabin had been violently tested, and Caleb had proven it was built on a foundation of granite. In the aftermath, the silence in the cabin was heavy, charged with what had happened. Caleb moved with quiet purpose, attending to the grim task of dealing with the intruders. He didn't ask for help, didn't speak of it more than was necessary. Alara watched him, a mixture of shock, gratitude, and awe churning within her. This man, who had saved her from the storm, had now saved her from the cruelty of men. He was a force of nature, as much a part of the wild, dangerous world outside as the blizzard itself. Yet here, in this cabin, he had provided sanctuary. He reinforced the broken door as best he could, working methodically. The storm outside had indeed broken. The wind was now a gentle whisper, and the snow had stopped. Patches of clear sky were visible through the small, ice-frosted window. The mountain was still vast and white, but no longer actively hostile. The following morning, the air was crisp and still. The world outside the cabin was breathtakingly beautiful, covered in a pristine blanket of snow, sparkling under a pale sun. But the beauty was stark, unforgiving. Alara stood in the doorway, breathing in the cold, clean air. Her body felt stronger than it had in years, her mind clearer. The ordeal had stripped away the non-essentials, the anxieties about social expectations and appearances that had weighed her down. She had faced death, despair, and violence, and she had survived. Not alone, but with the quiet aid of a man who asked for nothing in return. Caleb stood a little distance away, sharpening his axe near the woodpile. He didn't look at her, giving her space. The silence between them now was different again, not tense, not anxious, but companionable, filled with unspoken understanding and mutual respect. He had seen her at her weakest, most vulnerable. She had seen him at his most capable, most dangerous. They were two people who had faced down the world and found a quiet strength in the face of it, together. The thought of leaving hung in the air. She was strong enough to travel now. The path back to civilization would be difficult but possible. But the prospect felt like abandoning something precious, something fragile that had grown in the heart of the storm. The world outside the mountain held judgment, hardship, the ghosts of her past. This cabin, this quiet life with Caleb, offered a different kind of existence. Challenging, perhaps, but honest, free from the pretense and cruelty she had known. She turned back to face him, her gaze steady. He met her eyes then, waiting. There was no expectation in his look, no pressure. The choice was hers. She thought of the woman who had collapsed in the snow, broken, defeated. She thought of the woman who stood here now, bruised, perhaps, but resilient, looking towards a future she hadn't dared to imagine before. The mountain had tested her, broken her down, but in doing so, it had also forged something new within her, something strong and enduring. And Caleb, the quiet, stoic mountain man, had been the unexpected fire in that forging. "Caleb," she said, her voice clear and steady. He lowered the axe, waiting. The word hung in the air, a simple name that now held a complex weight of shared experience and unspoken connection. The mountains spread before them, vast and silent, no longer a place of fear, but a potential home. The choice was hers, and for the first time in a long time, Alara felt truly free to make it. She looked out at the pristine, silent landscape, then back at the man who had saved her, his presence a quiet anchor in this wild world. The storm had passed, but its passing had revealed not just the harsh beauty of the mountain, but also the quiet strength of the human spirit and the unexpected possibility of connection forged in the crucible of survival. Resilience wasn't just about enduring. It was about finding life and hope in the most desolate places. And sometimes, salvation came not in the form of a town or society, but in the quiet strength of a stranger who saw not what was lost, but what could be found.